Welcome to Way Back When, Big Blend Radio's History Podcast. Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Way Back When History Show. And you know what? We love history, but what's even better is when someone has written a historical fiction novel, focusing on something that has happened in history. After all, people are very fascinating, and that's what history is about. History is really a big bunch of gossip, I think. That's my own personal opinion. But of course, then we have wars and things like that that ruin the gossip. But I'm very excited today because we're going to talk about a little bit of scandal, some women's history, and some history that you're going to find. You could have maybe, raise your eyebrows a little bit here. We've got Barbara Southard joining us. She's a writer and an author, and her historical fiction novel, Unruly Human Hearts, is out now. It just released January 28th, 2025 through She Writes Press. And this has got some good scandals in it. So welcome, Barbara. How are you?
Well, just fine.
Good to have you here. And yes, don't you think that history is like a bunch of gossip?
Well, yes, but I think the idea of the book is to get into deeper human feelings, yes. Because I think the scandal of the Beecher-Tilton scandal, based on the famous case of 1875, in which the famous, probably the most famous preacher of his epoch, Henry Ward Beecher, was accused of adultery. And I really want to go into the deeper feelings of the triangle, which involved Theodore Tilton, the journalist, and Elizabeth Tilton, his wife. And the accusation was, of course, adultery between Reverend Beecher and Elizabeth.
Yeah, so this is a famous case for many historians. Some of us may not know about it. And I love that you wrote it as a novel, because I think that's a very easy way for us to interpret history and to kind of get it under our skin and bring that emotion and the reality of what Elizabeth was going through too. And I think that's something I really want to delve into, because, this is women's history. And everyone, you can go to Barbara's website. It's barbarasouthard.com, and that's Southard. You can go there, and she's also got a book of essays on there. And anyway, it's great to connect there. She has done a lot in the world of history and women's history. So I'm very excited about what you've written. And just, when you think about, can you take us back to when all of this happened? Because it was almost like men could get away with things, right? And having an affair, but a woman couldn't, right? And then you've got spirituality tied into this too.
Yes. And of course, I wrote it with the idea of giving the woman's perspective, which of course was somewhat more difficult because both of the men had a public platform. The most famous preacher of the era, one book written about Henry Ward Beecher said he was the most famous man in America at that time. And of course, Theodore Tilton, the husband, was a journalist, also with a public platform. Both of them testified at the trial. But Elizabeth's point of view is more difficult to get because she was a housewife with 4 children, and so I really wanted to bring her point of view. And interesting that all 3 characters had progressive ideals. The Reverend had been very important in the abolitionist movement, as was the journalist Theodore Tilton. They collaborated; they were friends. And in some sense, Theodore was a protege of Henry Ward Beecher. And at some point, they were involved not only in the women's suffrage movement and helping freed slaves, etc., but they were influenced by the theory of free love, which was not the idea of having a lot of affairs, but of being free to express love outside of marriage. And this then turned out it's easy to believe in something, and particularly it's easy for men to follow that belief and not to accept it when the women there involved would also follow the belief. And so it all began with Theodore justifying his extramarital affairs in terms of free love, Elizabeth finally forgiving him, in a very generous way. But then when this kind of freed her to express her feelings toward Reverend Beecher, and they shared a deep religious feeling, then, of course, when she eventually admitted the truth to her husband, it was like free love for me, but not for you. The double standard was very, of course, very strong, and the double standard, I think, still exists. Maybe not as strong today, but it still does exist.
Well, I think it's also the free love part of it is very interesting on the spiritual side, because I think we're still having that. That's still probably where the biggest battle is on for free love, is through different spiritual beliefs and religious beliefs, right? I mean, even when I think about free love, today we're looking at, free love for those who may be gay or LGBTQ, right? That there's that, and so free love could mean different things for different people today.
Yes, and it's interesting that, of course, the idea of free love and the gospel of love, which challenged Calvinism at this time, had different origins, but the characters, there was some overlap for them. And of course, Beecher, the famous preacher, was very important because he, as a child, had suffered because his own father insisted on Calvinist beliefs, that even if you tell a lie, maybe that indicates that you're going to hell. God is not going to forgive you. And he preached the gospel of love, which was God is not a punishing God. God is a God of love. And he compared this to the love that women have for their children, and this influenced Elizabeth greatly. And for instance, she supported women's suffrage, as did Beecher and her husband. But the idea was that women would, vote for a better world for children. They would vote for help to the helpless, to the poor, etc. And so she thought about women's suffrage in terms of social reform and helping the poor, sort of part of the gospel of love. But then, of course, they got to the point where they kind of thought, well, if love is the basis of spirituality and ethics, then if you truly love someone, not just a sexual attraction, but a true love, it can't be evil. That was both point of view of both Beecher and Elizabeth. On the other hand, Theodore, for him, the main thing in ethics was truth. And so he thought that if marriage is restricted completely to one, just to the marital partners, then there will be lying, and that will undermine their whole relationship. So he thought marriages were better if they were kind of like an open marriage. The idea, of course, in the 20th century.
Wow. So for you, I mean, the story, like you were saying, it's a famous story, but what was it that led you to go, hey, I want to write this. I want to, go down this rabbit hole, if you will, of this story. And then, because you could have written a book about it, right, as a nonfiction book. But what led you to, because I was saying, like, to me, historical novels were like one of the biggest ways I learned history growing up. They were everything to me, because it gave you the atmosphere and the texture of what was going on, and you got more emotion than if you were reading, your textbook in school going, okay, on this date, this happened. And it was like a battle happened, but there was no emotion in it. You didn't really get to connect with the people, depending, of what you were studying and where, right? But unless you go to the places where, events happened, I always found historical novels to be one of those just fantastic ways to learn, at least to get the base story. And then you can go, into the nonfiction side and get the true details, right? The true facts. So what was your, first thing was, hey, why am I going to write this, and go down this rabbit hole? And then why did you choose fiction?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I think that my interest in the case came after teaching a graduate class and having a discussion in which at first they weren't that interested in the whole thing. But when I said something about that this case was as famous as the alleged sexual intimacies between President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, then they got more interested. And I remember that one young woman in the class kind of said, Yeah, but and the two men survived, and Beecher continued to be an important preacher. But what happened to Elizabeth? So then, my first reaction to that as a historian was, to really research into, and to write an article, and thinking about writing a nonfiction book. But for two reasons, I chose fiction. One, in order to fill in the emotional gaps, and particularly to fill in Elizabeth's story, because one problem with history is we rely heavily on written records, of course, and men and the powerful in general dominate written records. I mean, women and the poor, the uneducated, often don't leave any written records. And so for two reasons, I thought, number one, that the complexity of the emotional involvement between the three, because it's a novel about love and loyalty as well as betrayal. And so the complexity of of a triangle relationship. And secondly, the idea of giving importance to Elizabeth, giving her a voice. Those were the two things. And it's interesting that the research I did, I read some secondary, and then I went into the trial records, etc. And when I was doing it for the historical article, I was looking for social issues. But then when I decided to write a novel, I had to go back to those sources and read them in a different way to sort of feel the characters and be able to imagine conversations among the three of them or between two of them. These conversations would come into my head. So I noticed that it's a different. One thing is looking for social change in history, social issues, and the other thing is to actually capture the characters and feel that they're part of you as an author. So that I went back to the sources, and I was very happy to discover that one of the reasons I was able to give voice to Elizabeth was that her husband, in an act of betrayal, published her letters to him in the press, which she regarded as, violating all of the concept of privacy, which was stronger in those days even than today. But for me, the letters gave me tremendous insight into Elizabeth and her charitable and forgiving nature, her point of view, etc. And one of the historians who wrote a book about called The Trials of Intimacy, Richard Fox, he included those letters in his book. So I didn't even have to go to each individual newspaper to find them. So that was a great help for her point of view.
So then there was gossip involved. See, there was that bit of gossip in there. Well, the scandals, that piques everyone's interest. But like you're saying, it goes, the gossip and the scandal part, that's the superficial side. There's always something deeper going on behind any scandal, and people fall in love, from attraction, right? There's physical attraction. There's, attraction, from, looking up to someone and respecting and admiring, attraction. And then there's attraction because you're not being, appreciated maybe like in your marriage. So maybe Elizabeth is kind of feeling, her husband did great things, but maybe not for her as much.
Yes, definitely. The issue of him vocally supporting women's rights, women's suffrage, and yet being rather traditional in his macho relationship with his wife was definitely part of it. And I think also that Elizabeth's religious views were closer to Beecher's. Tilton had some doubts, and his religion was not so personal. It was more a matter of principles, etc. While both Elizabeth and Beecher felt this very personal relationship with God, and the idea, of course, of the gospel of love and the love of God.
So also when you look at this, having what we'd say an affair, right? I find it really interesting how through history, how men have been able to have more than one wife, right? They've had mistresses, and women knew about that. And then it kind of, the free love part of it, as soon as women start to do something, then it, even if they think it's okay. I mean, I know today there are people who are together but agree to see other people. And I don't think it always works out as well as they think. Someone always gets hurt somewhere. And it just seems that way. But there was this time frame, and this is even goes into my own family. Um, like my mom discovered that her dad had three other wives all at the same time. And no, he's not Mormon. It's the first thing everyone asks, but no. He just got around, and then he had children with these wives and named them all the same thing. There's more than one Nancy, y'all. More than
Oh
one
my
Nancy.
goodness.
So, and this is, you got to think, going in the 30s and 40s and 50s, right? So, and we've heard so many stories of that era. And I'm going, okay, so around that time too, is this a post World War II thing where everybody got happy and did naughty things? But there was also this era where, the switch ups, what do they call it? Swapping, like wife swapping or whatever at a party.
Oh, yeah.
Where they'd have that big bowl and everybody would put their keys in and end up swapping for the night, like those kind of parties. So nothing good came of those either. I mean, there's been stories about that. So it's interesting. This kind of, because this is a little, more historical than what I'm talking about, but I mean, historically through time, men have been able to do whatever they want, but women, not so much,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, definitely. I think that the period when I was, growing up from adolescence into adulthood, I was influenced, of course, by the second wave of feminism, at that time, and also that was the time of the quote sexual revolution. And of course, those in favor of the sexual revolution, argued that it was liberating because, of course, women had always been more condemned for either premarital or extramarital sex. But the question I remember discussing with my friends at the time was, okay, so sexual liberation sounds fine, but is it going to be applied equally, or even can it be? Because I'm talking about the 60s, the 70s, women were still very economically dependent on men. They had that power. And so the question
Motherhood.
is, well, maybe it's good in theory, but does it work when there's not gender equality?
Mm.
And that would
That's
be
a
a
good
question, obviously, for Elizabeth, because she didn't have her own income at this time, and she had 4 children
Yeah.
eventually, and
Yeah. Their children, having children changes everything too, because you're supposed to be the dutiful wife and the dutiful mother. And so it's, we haven't quite evolved out of that quite yet. And it's difficult. I think I remember being, when I was in high school at that time frame, divorce was only becoming okay. Like if somebody got divorced in your family, or your parents got divorced, that was like, oh, someone did something really bad. You know what I mean? It was a big scandal. Divorce was a scandal.
Yeah,
And,
I remember that.
Yeah. So it's kind of, you've put this whole timeline of how, how things are. And it's always, and the single moms always got looked down upon, right? That the single moms almost got looked down upon as though they were promiscuous, and it's their fault they did something. And so it's always the woman's fault when, in these circumstances. So I'm not, knocking men, anyone. I'm just saying this is kind of historically there, what happened.
Right.
So women being able to have different partners and be a mom, that's been a difficult thing, I think. We're getting better, but I don't know now. It's changed. We're kind of going backwards on some things. So it's kind of interesting, even bringing up feminism and women's rights and women's right to free love. It's going to be interesting. I think your book is really timely, quite frankly, even though we're talking it as historical fiction. It's pretty timely, I think. What do you think?
Yes, I do, because I think that, since my early adulthood, there's been a lot of progress. I mean, definitely women are more economically independent and in the United States. And I think that many more have their own careers and think about their own careers. I kind of feel that in our present atmosphere that some of those gains are being questioned. So it's a good idea to go back and see how things work. And another thing that, I think the novel touches a little bit on is that gender inequality creates difficulties for women, but also it's usually accompanied by like strong concepts of male honor, etc., which may make it more difficult for men. And I think particularly in the character of Theodore Tilton, the husband, there are moments when he wants to forgive his wife and his best friend.
Oh,
But there are questions of other people's attitudes outside, and whether he's a weak man and losing his honor. So there are other. And I think that Elizabeth herself was kind of sensitive to the difficulties that the men faced as well. So yeah, I think that a lot of gender inequality can have negative consequences for men as well as women.
yeah, because it also has to do about, who are you in the community? And it is, if you're a preacher or you're the mayor or something like that, that's a big deal, and
Yeah, absolutely.
so it's so funny because, when you have those roles in the community, you're supposed to be like perfect, squeaky clean, and we all know that's not true. That doesn't happen that
No.
way. It doesn't happen that way. But this is so fascinating because, that time frame, I mean, we're still very puritanical then. And it kind of, this free love part goes into a little history that I've got to get into. It's kind of a rabbit hole for me. And there's this era, and it kind of similar. And I think it was where we were creating these utopian societies across the country. And it's fascinating to me. And these utopian societies were about there. Some of them were very puritanical. Greeley, Colorado was based on one and named after Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Times. And he had Nathan Meeker, I think, was a person who actually settled the town in his honor. And they had these, there will be temperance, you weren't going to do any of these things. It was about education, a very squeaky clean, they try to bring like the like New York kind of area to Northwest Colorado, which was a different thing. They even imported trees and all of this kind of stuff. But then what's so funny is now this became the first Go Cup region of Colorado, which means they have all these breweries downtown, and they became the very first city in Colorado where you could walk around with a beer mug and go from brewery to brewery in the downtown. How about that? So that didn't quite work. And then another utopian society, there's another one, New Harmony in Indiana, that we found. And I'm going, what is going on that everybody had to create these societies like these? It was almost like a commune, but not like a hippie commune. So if you say commune, everybody thinks hippies or cults, right? And this can maybe get to that line of cult. There was one in New Lano Colony, is what they called themselves, Colony, in Louisiana. And it's on the eastern side of the state and near DeRidder area. And this was a big logging community, and that's part of the history of the Kisatchie National Forest. And this colony, women had more rights in this colony than federally in the country. Women were running things. Women were making wine. They were making their own wine. They had their own school. They did all of these things, industry. And it was started by a guy who actually tried to run for president from California. He started in LA. It didn't work there. I think he ran in politics there. And then he went to the swamps of Louisiana. Go figure. And this colony is there. They have all these art. They have a whole museum. And it's really about women's rights and women's history, and women were allowed to earn money. Women were allowed to do things. And this is in the South, y'all.
Wow.
So I find that fascinating, right? So this kind of ties in a very odd way about women, these colonies and free love. See, free love was part of that, yet it wasn't in the hippie era. We're talking the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was not in the hippie movement, and that free love, a little different. So,
Right.
so I find that what you've researched and what you're talking about, it goes through all these different, it's kind of a ripple effect is where I'm going with that, because of women having more power and being able to have free love. And like what you're saying, which you're really making me think now, is about gender equality first before the
Right.
sexual equality.
And I think
Yeah.
that these three people all wanted to build a better society, and with these new ideas, more freedom, etc. But once the gossip mill starts, then of course, if you're a reverend, you can't admit that you believe in free love. And the interesting thing is that the radical feminist Victoria Woodhull was the one who brought out the fact that this was going on. And of course, she took the position, no, that she didn't think there was anything wrong with it. But what was wrong was that the Reverend Beecher was not willing to say out loud that he believed in free love. But imagine, how could a reverend in a church, Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, come and say that, yes, I believe in free love? But and then, of
Wow.
course, later, Victoria Woodhull and her radical ideas about sex and everything created difficulties for the women's suffrage movement, which was trying to regroup after in the Reconstruction era, because they had, of course, hoped for women to win the vote with the same amendment as freed slaves, and that didn't happen. Only freed men got the vote, and of course they didn't hold on to it for very long because the Ku Klux Klan was organized, etc. Yeah,
Wow.
but it's interesting that they had all these advanced ideas, which were almost like you would say, like one of these communes, and yet
Yeah.
how could they hold on to them when they were attacked, and of course there were other men who just wanted to go after the Reverend because he was more famous as a preacher than they were. I mean, there was all those kind of conflicts as well.
This is
Yeah.
fascinating to me. So, yeah, I think we were kind of still, well, you've got to think about, like Quakers, right? And how much they did for, just, the Underground Railroad and equality. They were mostly the abolitionists. And then here we come, into this, I think we have this puritanical background, right? The Puritans were not going to do anything, but then it starts to evolve. Like, as you're saying, with this free love and the religious behind that, the religious beliefs behind that about how God perceives free love, right? And so I think this is kind of like that beginning of those societies I'm talking about, these new societies. Like, they wanted, and they're all different, but there's these beliefs. Like that one town in Indiana had a different name, but then they called it New Harmony because they wanted this harmonious living and peace and love for all kind of things. But this is, like I said, before, the hippie communes and that era.
Right.
And so this is, I think it's all kind of that change. And then things start to become reality, and then it's shocking, when it becomes real.
Yes.
It's
and then people interpret it in negative ways. Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I definitely tried to avoid this picture of Reverend Beecher as just one of these preachers taking advantage of people of women in his flock, so to speak. Because maybe there was a little element of that, but it was also much more complex than that. And he was a complex character, and I wanted to give that complexity, see that complexity not only in Elizabeth and in Theodore, but also in the Reverend. I didn't want to take this position, that he was, just taking advantage of his position, because it was a little more complicated than that.
I think it always is, those relationships, and that's part of the attraction too. You know, there's some little spark about when you know you're not supposed to be doing something deep down. You know what I mean? There is.
Yeah.
There is, come on, and you can't help what your body does. It's like, if you're attracted to someone, that's that. I wanted to ask, because, your career as a historian, you've done a lot in regards to women's history. Puerto Rico, also India, you've covered that, which that's a very fascinating, that's amazing when you think about what women have gone through for years in India. And that's a whole other conversation. That's a big one. What led you into getting into women's history specifically? It seems that you're pulled there pretty strongly.
I'm thinking of it. My dissertation was on the nationalist movement in India. And but while I was working on it, because it was mainly at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, I became very much aware of these social reform movements, to improve the position of women, and then, of course, the difficulty that the leaders of the nationalist movement had in like defending Indian culture, but trying to find a part of Indian culture that was more fair to women, and how they combine that. So I got increasingly interested. So then, when my next project was on the women's suffrage movement, taking a particular, because India has different cultures, in Bengal, which is in northeastern India, and looking at that and how the women who led that also, because they're in a colonial situation, so they have to defend their own ancient culture as well as ask for women's rights. And so I became quite interested in that as well. And but at the University of Puerto Rico, I taught courses on Asia, but also on the United States, and it was one of those courses that the students kind of got me really interested in this court case.
And, wow, that's amazing. I'm just still blown away that he published her letters. That's just that, and I think that's kind of that revenge part, right? And also just to keep your own face, but it's still, your own face amongst, your people and your community. And as a journalist, for him, it's weird that he did that. And it's complex, like you're saying, their whole story is, but for him to publish her letters, that's just
right.
Wow.
Well, basically what the letters were between them, and they were, she was expressing her positive feelings for her husband in these letters. They're very well written. And apparently because she didn't testify at the trial, but she testified in a church investigation beforehand. And not only she testified, but a ward that they had who was an orphan, or an abandoned child, we should say, and helped Elizabeth with the house and was sort of like a daughter to her. But she gave a lot of testimony on him being completely unreasonable and making Elizabeth cry and accusing her of not being a good housekeeper, etc. So apparently he wanted to publish these letters in which she expressed her love for him to counter that, the negative impression that Bessie, their ward, had created.
Wow, but still, yeah, that's
interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, this is a very good story. I mean, because it makes you really think about, where we are today and that whole ripple effect that I was talking about. I really appreciate you joining us on the show to talk about this. And I want everyone to know, again, the book is out now, and I think the title is fantastic. That's the perfect title. Unruly Human Hearts is the name, and it's by Barbara Southard, and you can go to barbarasouthard.com. Of course, get it on Amazon, bookshop.org, all those places. You can check it out there. And thank you so much for joining us and for doing all the work you've done in women's history.
Oh, thank you so much. We had a very interesting conversation.
I know y'all is going down other pathways, but that's always good because everything's connected somewhere, right? Isn't that the thing about when you write a book like this, that it all connects to something else somewhere?
Yes,
It's
absolutely. Yeah.
that's what happens with history. It's the rabbit hole syndrome. Thank you for joining us, listeners.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us here on Big Blend Radio's Way Back When History Podcast. Keep up with us at bigblendradio.com.